So hello, webinar attendees. My name is Marisol Morales, and I serve as the Vice President for Network Leadership with Campus Compact. We're so happy to have you as part of our eighth webinar in this year's National Webinar Series titled Building Democratic Skills Through Deliberative Dialogue. I will be introducing our presenters shortly, but I just want to do a few plugs before we get started. One is to encourage folks to check out our Compact Nation podcast. There's always really great material in there. We're really excited about it. I'm a co-host along with President of Campus Compact, Andrew Seligson, and the Director of Iowa-Minnesota Campus Compact, Emily Shields. I also want to remind folks that there's still time to register for the Campus Compact National Conference taking place in Seattle, Washington, March 29th through April 1st. And we just announced our Impact Award recipients. So check out our social media and website to find out who our awardees are. We're really excited about our first year awards, our inaugural awards, Impact Awards. So let me start off by introducing our presenters. First, we have Leslie Garvin, who's the Executive Director at North Carolina Campus Compact. Leslie has been the Executive Director since 2015. She served as Associate Director of North Carolina Campus Compact from 2005 to 2014. Garvin leads the Compact's Deliberative Dialogue Initiative and has trained hundreds of faculty, staff, and students, as well as community partners across the state and country in this method. She is a member of the Service Year North Carolina Advisory Council and an advisory committee on civic health for the Institute for Emerging Issues. Garvin was named a 2016 White Riley Peterson Policy Fellow to study after-school and expanded learning policy and develop and implement a state-level policy project in partnership with North Carolina Center for After-School Programs and the National After-School Alliance. Garvin holds a Master's of Social Work with a concentration in social and economic development and specialization in management, as well as a Bachelor's in Political Science, both from Washington University in St. Louis. Next, we have Maggie Cummins. She's Shelton Professor of Political Science at Queen's University of Charlotte. Dr. Maggie Cummins her teaching and research interests are in U.S. Latin American relations and U.S. immigration policy. She integrates deliberative dialogue and experiential learning into her courses, encouraging students to learn and practice skills that help them be more comfortable and effective in community engagement. And finally, we have Bob Frigo, who's the Associate Director of the Coronado Center for Service Learning Community Engagement at Elon University. Bob is the Associate Director and an instructor in the Department of English at Elon University. He provides leadership for co-curricular service learning programs and coordinates civic and political engagement efforts at the university. He has previously worked at North Carolina State University, Georgia Southern University, Savannah College of Art and Design, and the University of Birmingham. He holds a Master's in Irish Literature from Queen's University, Belfast, and a Master's of Education from the University of South Carolina, and a BA in English from Marquette University. So welcome to our panelists, and we're excited to have you present. Thank you.
Thanks, Marisol. Good afternoon, everyone. I am so excited that you are here with us today, and I'm especially excited to co-present with two amazing colleagues in North Carolina, Maggie Cummins and Bob Frigo. So we're going to get started with a quick poll, and the question we're asking is, have you ever participated in any of these civic practices? And we invite you to click all that you have participated in. And you'll have to scroll down to get the final option there. Oh, it's only allowing folks to vote for one option. see. Marisol, is that something you can fix, or do we just want to see?
Yeah, let me end the poll and relaunch it.
Okay. Thanks for letting us know. All right, we'll take a few seconds here to get that reset. So while that's happening, I'll go ahead and I'll put the second part of this that we're not going to actually poll you on, but I would like you to consider who taught or modeled these practices, and did you have the opportunity to practice them in advance? And so that's just something to think about. You don't need to respond, but that's sort of the question guiding sort of our desire to implement methods such as deliberative dialogue. So that's just something for you to think about. How did you learn these practices? Did you see your family? If we take voting, for example, I think we would want to assume that folks are seeing that with their family, they're seeing that with their community. But the reality is, in the 2016 election, that 30% of eligible voters did not vote. So it's entirely possible that someone could live in a setting where they don't see people exercising that. I know for myself, I am a poll worker. I've been doing that for about a decade. I never knew anyone who was a poll worker. And it was just something that I heard about and I thought I wanted to participate. 10 years ago, I was the youngest poll worker in the room. I'm still the youngest poll worker in the room. so I strongly encourage you, if you have not considered that you will think about that as one of those civic practices you can engage in. For the sake of time, I'm going to go on past this and we'll come back to the poll when we're ready. So I just want to say that today's primary takeaway, if you don't get anything else, is that higher education has a critical role to play in developing democratic and civic practices. And ancillary to that concept today is, for us, deliberative dialogue is one effective method in terms of practicing democracy. So I'm just going to quickly tell you about the journey that our organization has taken to deliberative dialogue. So it started in 2008 when we were approached by Paul Loeb and the Campus Election Engagement Project to begin to think about election engagement as a piece of our work. You'll be able to see from the evolution that started out strictly being presidential. Then we decided, well, we should probably include the midterm. Over time, we developed a voter summit. At some point, we partnered with the Institute of Political Leadership to host the training for students that were interested in actually going into politics. And then this year, we actually have broadened our scope to include census engagement. In the midst of all that, back in 2013, a local funder convened all the organizations in the state that do election engagement. And we created a coalition that we have facilitated ever since. So this is part of the journey. We said, okay, election engagement, that's a critical piece that we've been missing. Another piece of it began to manifest itself in our programming. So as you all, I hope know, that in 2012, AAC&U released A Crucible Moment, College Learning and Democracy's Future. And it was really a call to action to say, or to challenge higher education to see themselves in this role. And you'll see that after that, in 2013 was when we invited the National Issues Forum to come to our event so that we could begin to learn at least one of the skills that we can begin to practice in terms of democracy and the practices of democracy. Peter Levine challenged us as well about higher education's role. And then you'll see from there, ever since then, we've been embracing that sort of language and that sort of framework. For those of you who did not see the Crucible Moment or weren't in the field when it came about or when it was released, one of the challenges that they, or one of the issues that they raised is that we are becoming a citizenless democracy. That what we're facing are sideline citizens. And that was the Kettering Foundation president. They highlighted some of the things that now we take for granted. We all know that they exist. The incivility, the hyperpartisanship, the decline in civic education. We take those things for granted now because they're so obvious. But back then, that was a real eye-opener for us and something we began talking about. They talked about some of the data out there that citizens aren't contacting public officials, college seniors aren't passing civic literacy exams. Just a third of the students that were surveyed agree that faculty actually advocate for students to become active and involved citizens, and only a third of college students agree that their college education resulted in increased civic capacities. One of the things they also reminded us of is that back in 1947, when President Truman commissioned a group to determine what are the real goals of higher education. Remember, we were coming out of the World War II and looking at the world and countries that were collapsing and just all the challenges. And a big piece of what they felt the role of higher education in America was democratic, to promote these ideas in every phase of living, to think about the way that we work internationally, and then to also help students think about how to solve social problems. And they provided a framework for the types of skills, knowledge, and values that they believe that higher ed should be embracing. And Campus Compact actually wrote a praxis brief in response to that with some more ideas. So if you haven't seen any of those documents, I strongly encourage you to do that. And there are also a lot of other resources. You're all gonna get these slides, so you'll be able to look at those. But it was some work by Levine, a book that came out. It was the Democratic Engagement White Paper with Patty Clayton and Saltmarsh and Matt Hartley, Crucible Moment, obviously. And then there was this really great article that came out in the Chronicle of Higher Education, Innovation Alone Won't Fix Social Problems. And then, of course, there's the great work that IDHE does, and Nancy Thomas, everything by Harry Boyd. And then for me, when the book came out in 2017, Where's the Wisdom in Service Learning? I think that was when I was really struck by the fact, and this is a book that talked to the pioneers in the service learning movement, the folks who first got it started 30-something years ago. And one of their ideals had been that it would transform higher education, it would transform society, that it would go beyond being nice but necessary, and really they viewed it as a radical pedagogy or a practice or a way of thinking about the world. And many expressed disappointment that we haven't fulfilled that. And so this article I talked about, that innovation is not enough, I really love it. And if you haven't read it, you should. And they were challenging the sort of new movement towards innovation and social entrepreneurship. Like, come up with an idea in this semester, implement it, and you'll change the world. And they, in this quote you'll see, they talked about higher ed embraces its role in developing citizens, but many times in the margins, it's under service, nice, not a necessity. But this question of, if we want students to look beyond where they are, to have more empathy, to be active citizens, how are we teaching them to do that? And innovation, leadership, and service is insufficient. And so this final question here, where are we teaching our students about the political and social processes and infrastructures that are necessary to make an idea a reality? So there's a lot more involved with community change than just, I had a great idea to sell headbands for people that are struggling in Kenya. And so I'm pleased to see, this is actually a collection of my books I pulled from the shelf, that there's been a lot produced talking about this issue and challenging us around democracy and these sort of practices. And then Harry Boyd, of course, always challenges us in profound ways about this role of higher education. And one of the things he says is it's time for us to just stop in terms of how we educate students around their democratic practices. Stop just civics and service to these empowering pedagogies which develop their capacities and identities as civic producers and not just consumers. And so these are my realizations, and anyone in North Carolina has heard me say a million times this Dewey quote, because I just love it, that democracy must be born anew every generation, and education is its midwife. And so I came to the realization that most of us lack the skills and knowledge to participate in public problem solving. Students are often not given the opportunity to engage in democratic practices. We're mostly consumers rather than citizens. Our democracy is stressed. I won't say in crisis, I'll say stressed. And I love this quote from the Rockefeller Brothers Fund that I ran across some time ago. For a democracy to thrive, citizens must be informed, engaged, empowered, and assertive. So again, the takeaway, higher ed has a critical role to play. Deliberative dialogue is one effective model for these civic practices. So we've been on all these parts of the journey. I will say this actually isn't a straight line or a curvy line. In some ways it's a circle, because I don't think we get rid of these other methods. I think they all work together. And so you'll see even in our 2018 mission statement that strengthening democracy is, we wanted to really raise that up, as this is a goal of this work of higher education and civic and community engagement. And so it's sort of, these two are connected, community engagement and democratic engagement. In some ways they're the same thing, in some ways there's some distinctions, but for us, they're part of the same ecosystem. And so the Kettering Foundation, as I shift into us thinking about deliberative dialogue as a model, they talk a lot about how the fact that many of us, we don't feel comfortable doing the practice of democracy. We're not always sure that we have power or resources. We're not sure we can trust people. We often disagree, and we feel in many ways shut out of the political system. And so they've got this whole framework about democratic practices and how they're developed. So they, you name the issues, you frame them, then you work together deliberatively, you identify resources, organize your actions, and then you keep the cycle going. And so their notion is that if we can do these routine tasks and engage in these empowering practices, they become democratic practices, they become habits, they become part of who we are. And so within the Kettering Foundation, they have the National Issues Forum, which is a network that is nonpartisan, nonprofit, and they actually publish the issue guides, but we'll talk a little bit more about. So they are part of the Kettering Foundation. And so to date, in North Carolina Campus Compact, we've facilitated trainings with representatives from 70 campuses in 12 states, over 550 faculty, staff, students, and community partners. So this is what we're going to cover. What is deliberation, the design and segments of a forum. I'm going to do a quick practice, talk about the moderator's role. We've got examples from the field, and then we'll wrap up. So what does it mean to deliberate? It's from the Latin consider or weigh. And so one of the things that I emphasize the most in trainings is we're not trying to weigh one above the other. We're trying to weigh them equally so that we can come to an informed decision by having really dug into the options for action. And so I like this from Oregon State University. There's some aspects of it that, we could talk about in terms of the distinction between dialogue and deliberation. But really, deliberation is about this process of weighing the options, of making the choices together, trying to see where we can come together and have common ground. But really it's about civic agency and feeling that we have talked about the issues, weighed the options, and are coming together for common action. So these are the components. For anyone who's not participated in a National Issues Forum, Deliberative Forum, there's the issue guide. There's the actual design of the forum. There are always going to be moderators who understand their role, of course, and then participants who are understanding the purpose. Why are we here? How is this different from a debate? How is this different from just a dialogue where we're just trying to come to understanding of each other? So the issue guide. An issue guide presents a choice framework. So within every issue guide, there are always 3 or 4 ways that we could approach the issue. And NIF really tries to base those options by looking at the values that we care about. Within it, the guide, there's always going to be some proposals for action, some proposals for change. They'll include some of the benefits. They'll include some of the trade-offs. And then there's questions that are typically involved that can encourage further deliberation and reflection. And so the guide itself really provides pretty much all that you need, in addition to, of course, having moderator skills to run any sort of a deliberative dialogue. And so the great news is that at this point, there are over 40 issue guides available. And that's what they look like over to the right if you actually get the hard copy or download it online. That's the good news. You can download the PDFs yourself instead of ordering. And I think if you order one, it's about $1.99. I think that's right, Bob, if you actually want it in hand. But you really can just download it and make copies yourself. So these are some of the latest topics, if you're wondering what sort of topics are involved. And again, this is just a sampling. So the newest one is about healthcare. How can we bring costs down? One came out last year about the national debt. There was one also last year, what would we have to give up to get the political system that we want? Because we're a house divided. And then there's another one from last year, and it was about foreign policy, keeping America safe, what's our greatest threat, how should we respond? But they also have developed what they call issue advisories. So it's not a full-scale issue guide, doesn't have all the options and the trade-offs and the benefits listed, but it does give the choice framework. And so one came out last year that's pretty powerful. How should we prevent mass shootings in our community? And so the idea with the issue advisory is that you would use it, it's only like a page or two, and then you would have to do some extra work to determine kind of what are some of these benefits that we want to talk about, what are some of the trade-offs, think about those in advance. And then there was also one on driverless vehicles, which I thought was always really interesting. And so they develop these guides. They do a lot of research. For those of you who are familiar with the Kettering Foundation, you know that that's their focus, is doing research on sort of citizen engagement and involvement. They do a lot of pre-testing. They try not to make the options just about left and right and just about a legislative proposal, but to really make them a little more complex and nuanced. And of course, they're values-based. So the design, I talked about that one piece of this is you have the actual guide, but there's actually a formal design that every forum is expected to adopt or to utilize. And so you begin with a welcome, and then together you determine ground rules. Typically we offer some in advance that have already been created, and then try to crowdsource other ideas. And then you have people introduce themselves, and then you actually introduce the topic. The great news is that the National Issues Forum has created videos for many of the more recent issue guides. And so that starter video, because let's be honest, a lot of people come to a forum, and I'm going to look to see if Maggie and Bob shake their head, having not read the issue guide in advance. And so you, in some ways, are playing catch up. And so the starter video will just summarize what in the issue guide is saying is the actual issue we're trying to address, what's the problem we're trying to solve, what's the challenge. Then you move into a personal stake, and this is where folks share their experience with the issue. And I'll give examples in a minute. And then we start the deliberative process, and we weigh the options. There's reflection, and then there's questionnaires. And NIF does this so that they can collect the data, see what people are learning. They've actually modified and even discontinued some issue guides based off of the feedback, because clearly it wasn't offering people the sort of deliberative process that they wanted. And most forums are an hour and a half to 2 hours. So within a deliberative forum, there are some very specific roles. There's always the moderator. You can identify a timekeeper if you as the moderator choose not to also play that role, although you need to be making sure time is being valued and honored. There's a recorder if you want to record some of the key takeaways and points that are there. Of course, you have your participants. And so as participants come, as you invite them, as you issue the invitation, it's important that you are helping them see, even if it's just once they arrive in the room, that this is a deliberative process. I always encourage folks to leave their credentials at the door, and that's sometimes challenging in higher education. So let's say that there's a faculty member who's an expert in whatever we're talking about. I think it's great for them to weigh in and share, and particularly correct something that's said that's definitely not true or factual. But we try to create a space where we are all together weighing those options in a way that everyone feels their voice is heard. Folks need to know we're trying to be serious about this. And then we're not trying to convince others. We're trying to weigh the options together, and we want folks to take part. And so I'm going to also add in what, for me, over time, have become two key elements of this. And that is this notion of trade-offs, and then this idea of values. So a trade-off, Webster says, it's a balancing of factors, it's a giving up of one thing in return for another. And so the question that I always ask participants to help shift their mindset is, if this action or this option worked perfectly, what might the downside be? Because what you're up against is people read the three options. They typically find one that's theirs. You know, that's the one that I embrace. I love that. That's the only way. It's got to be the best way. And that's what we're accustomed to in debates. You know, this is the right answer. And so what we're trying to do through this deliberative process is to say, there is not one policy decision, one solution proposed on earth that does not have a downside or that does not have consequences. Even if downside seems a little too negative, consequences. So that's a big part for me, is this trade-off concept. And then the values piece. And so this is some great work that Martin Carsason, I hope I'm saying his name right, has added into the process that I've seen others model and that I've adopted. And so he starts, or he's used this, the person that I was trained under started this way. But before people started deliberating, they talked about values. They looked at the preamble of the Constitution. There's justice, domestic tranquility, general welfare, liberty to others, liberty for our posterity. And then he has turned those into justice, security and safety, equality, freedom for all of us, and then freedom for future generations. And then he has folks rank that, and that's what I've been doing. And you will, of course, quickly discover people rank those values very differently. And the beauty of sort of setting that context prior to the deliberative process is then it allows to ask the question, which I always include, which is, someone that does embrace this approach or this option, what do they value, right? And looking at these values, what do they value? And so it's clear that some people value justice higher than security and safety, and there's some people, security and safety is what matters the most to them. And so the hope is that within the deliberative process, we're able to, whether or not we agree with that approach, to at least acknowledge that that person is upholding one of these values, but they're prioritizing it differently than I would, and I may not agree that that's the priority. So now we're going to do a quick practice. Unless there's a question right now just about the process itself. Bob, Maggie, or Metasol, do you see anything that I need to respond to at this point? All right, so this is where you all are going to need to, in the Q&A, to engage with us. Obviously, this is very hard to do. The one that we're going to work with for a few minutes is the changing world of work. What should we ask of higher education? And this is one that came out years ago, but I think it's relevant to anyone that's on the call. All right, so these are some of the ground rules that we typically include. Participants are equal, everyone should feel free to talk, no one should dominate, use I statements, keep comments brief so everyone has a chance to talk, don't interrupt, listening is as important as talking, speak to each other and there's just a moderator, what is said here stays here, what is learned here leaves. You know, we're all pretty familiar with these. So we won't crowdsource ground rules right now, although I'm sure you all could add some really phenomenal ideas to that. I'm looking at the chat, see if folks added. Okay, so it doesn't look like anybody was adding ideas. All right.
There's a question about equity versus equality.
In terms of a value? Yes, that, so again, I'm using the model that Dr. Carsason uses. And so that definitely is something that always comes up. And so I think if that's a value that you would want to add, again, he draws those from the preamble of the Constitution. You can certainly make the case that equity was the intent and not this question of equality, and use that as one of the values. The idea is just to help the participants, the students, the faculty, staff, the community partners begin to have the question around values being really what drives our decisions. It's what, what we've been taught to value in our community and our family, and that kind of thing. So then there's the thank you. That's a great question. And you can
There's
certainly
one more
add.
question that came up.
Say that again.
There's another question that came up.
Okay.
It says, do you think deliberative democracy, especially as associated with Kettering and NIF, is an appropriate and useful discussion model to engage issues and problems of race, racism, and racial justice?
Yeah, so I love that question. And that is one of the, I do have a screen. It talks about what are some of the limitations or critiques of this model. And so I will tell you up front in advance that is a valid critique of the model. And so we can talk a little bit more about that. But thank you. So you do the introduction, and then you can show a starter video. And for the sake of time, I won't do that. But just know that the starter videos are available. They're about 2 minutes, 2.5 minutes, and they summarize the topic. And so this is like the screenshot of that video. So these are the options within this issue guide. So again, the question is, there's this changing world of work out there. How should higher education respond? What is our role in this? And so option 1 is we need to be preparing students for the job market. That means we tailor our programs to what employers need, and we focus on vocational, pre-professional. I know this is not a new argument to anybody on this call. Another option is we can educate for leadership and change. And really what this is about is helping students become effective citizen leaders, and then they'll create kind of jobs. They'll build the kind of society that we're looking for. And then the third option is to build strong communities. They need to harness higher ed, the power to create jobs, generate business opportunities, provide skills, and drive development. So taking on that role as the driver of change and development and job creation. And so some of the highlights in the summary that they're saying are the changing, that are manifestations of the changing world of work, is that the workplace is being transformed because of new technologies, globalization, this reliance and proliferation of the freelance, independent contractors, temporary workers, folks who don't have job security often, but it's estimated that it's going to be 40% of the workforce this year. The summary also talks about higher education and the working or the employment community in our areas have a work preparation paradox. 96% of chief academic offers say that they are preparing students for the world of work. Only 14% of Americans agree, and only 11% of business leaders agree. And this was in 2013, because again, this is an older guide. So there's some sort of paradox or a disconnect. And then finally, they're building the case. There's disengagement and dissatisfaction, that many Americans are stressed. Many of them are not taking their time off. In some ways, that's a sense, an opportunity or a way for them to feel like they're having job security because they're working these long hours or not taking vacation. And then, of course, we all know the litany of critiques and challenges that higher ed is facing. Tuition's going up, enrollment's down at many institutions, lower birth rates, graduation rates, students have debt, may not have the skills they need. Many college graduates are unemployed, working minimum jobs, working jobs that don't require college credentials. So that's how the issue guide and what we would talk about as a group to set the stage for why we're even inviting ourselves into this question. Then we would spend time with our personal stake. What is your personal experience with this issue? How does it affect you? Why is this issue important to you or the people in your community? And so it's always interesting when I have done this one when there's students in the room, because for them, this is very personal because they want to be able to know that their degree is paying off. And then there are some faculty and staff, community partners who are parents of students who are soon to go to college. So there's all sorts of reasons. And of course, there's folks that work in higher ed who feel that their jobs are being questioned or threatened. So those are the types of things that you would surface in this personal stake so that we're all coming to understand sort of what are the perspectives and what are we bringing to this discussion. And then we deliberate. We give equal time to each option. I typically have someone who's read it to give the summary of what that approach is in their own words. I can do it, we can read it together. And then we always look at the benefits and trade-offs. What do you like about this approach to this question, or how we're going to solve? What would be the consequences of doing what you're suggesting? What would be an argument against the option that you like best? And then I typically discuss values as we're getting close to the end of talking about that particular approach. You know, what does someone who's drawn to this approach, what do they value? Then we always explore the missing voices. What key perspectives are missing in this room, right? If we're all people who work in higher education community engagement, we're going to be drawn probably to one of those choices very differently than a president or someone else would be. And then again, we use those questions that are in the moderator guide because they often spark further deliberation. And so we're back to this option one, preparing students for the job market. And so one of the ideas for action is that they say, look, we just need to have better relationships with business so that we are tailoring what we are learning for these student graduates. And then we ask, well, what do you like about this approach? And within that, this is one of the ideas. And we remind them again of the question, how should higher education respond to this changing world of work? And so we sit with that for a while. For the sake of time, I was going to have you all give some responses, but we won't. What do you like about this approach is where we would start. And again, this is just one of the ideas. And then we would talk about, and I always give a disclaimer, because what I find is an interesting thing that happens in these discussions is if someone doesn't really like that approach, they typically will tell us, I don't really like this, but if I have to think about what I like about it, this is what I would say. So I always, from the beginning, say, there's no need for disclaimers. What we're trying to do is practice perspective taking, thinking about what somebody that would value this, why there could be an argument for this. And so I really try to, as a moderator, ensure that we don't have a lot of disclaimers first. We're in a space where we're trying to learn how to talk about issues without that. And then, of course, we would move to, well, then what are the traits? We collect a lot of the positive things and why people think it's the right approach. And then we would get to our trade-offs and our downsides. So if higher ed adopts this approach to solve this changing world of work, you know, what are some of the downsides? So the example given for this one about developing closer partnerships, they only usually give one or two trade-offs, and then you have to crowdsource the rest of those in the actual training. So the downside that they give in the actual issue guide is degree programs oriented primarily around workforce development typically lack the elements of a more well-rounded curriculum like critical thinking, community service, collaborative problem solving. Then we do reflections. Has your thinking about this issue changed? We talk about actions and recommendations. What's one action that you could take related to this? If we collectively are moving towards action, then we would go a little bit deeper around policy and those kind of things. And then we have everybody do the questionnaires I talked about before. I won't get into the moderator's role because I need my other folks to have time, but obviously the role is to be neutral, to emphasize listening, to make sure that it's an inclusive environment and it's balanced, and listen deeply. So just a reminder, there's the components of a National Issues Forum, which is the guide, the design, the moderators, participants, and then within the design, there's the ground rules, the introduction, personal state, weighing the options, reflections, questionnaires, and then the time frame. 2 points to keep in mind. You can create your own issue guide. They have tools, publications to help you do that. We are currently in North Carolina developing our own naming and framing committee so that when issues arise, we're able to create our own guide. You can localize the issue, give some data, pre-readings, have a speaker who's connected to the issue. And then finally, these are just a start. And you need to consider your goals. Are you trying to teach and practice and learn these skills, or are you trying to take action on the issue? And so I'll give 2 examples and then I'll turn it over. So if the goal is to teach, practice, and learn, and you'll get these slides, Wake Forest University has a program called the Democracy Fellows where they had 30 students who for 4 years practice dialogues, and there's actually a book about it, and you'll have this. And then they did a 10-year alumni report, and they found that all of those skills they had practiced really transformed their civic identity. So they were able to listen to people with different views. They had more nuanced understanding of citizenship. They had more elaborate, nuanced, curious political communication. These are the things that we're reporting, and many of them had become involved in politics. So by practicing it for 4 years, it really taught them these skills. Pfeiffer University used it as part of a bigger dialogue program where they trained community dialogue ambassadors, which were students, so they could talk about different issues, so that they would not look at the community so they would see the community as multidimensional. And this is one of their forums they had about diversity and faith. And if you want to take action on an issue, I know Warren Wilson College, when their new president started, she had 2 campus-wide days, stopped classes, everybody came together to raise this question of how do we make this a more welcoming community for all. It was held in a chapel, they were tiny campus, and or a smaller campus. And they broke out into groups and then suggested action and had committees to take action. They did it another year and created their own guide on the same question. Maggie.
Thank you, Leslie. So I came to Deliberative Dialogue through a course I teach on immigration policy. I actually, my research is on US policy toward Latin America and immigration policy, trade policy. So I didn't really have much to do with civic engagement or civic skills, but I was always interested in it. And then through my work with North Carolina Campus Compact, I became familiar with the National Issues Forum, with some of these ideas about deliberation. So I started to explore it a little further. And if there are any academics, faculty members, or staff on the call, one of the things that I found really useful was then to explore this also within my discipline. So within the American Political Science Association, there's a teaching and learning conference, and we're increasingly doing panels and research on civic engagement and deliberative dialogue and all of these skills that we're talking about. So it's a good place to look for more information when you're looking for how to integrate this into your own work on your own campus. But I'm going to talk a little bit about my class and how I've used deliberative dialogue in the classroom. So we start actually with a process of active listening, which we call looping, and I'll talk about that more in just a second. And then over the course of the semester, we do 4 deliberative dialogues in which the students prepare dialogue and learn the skills, both of dialoguing themselves and of moderating different dialogues. They have pre-dialogue assignments, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. We reflect as a class on the role of dialogue in addressing community problems and how we can use these skills we've developed and this knowledge to kind of bring these ideas to the wider community. So we actually then at the end of the semester bring the skills to the new community. You can see on the right, we partnered with a church that's across the street from our campus that was running a semester-long program on immigrant justice, a week in immigrant justice. So my students went over and organized and led a dialogue with the church members on immigrant justice at the end of the semester. So the notion of active listening or looping, I actually have drawn a lot on the work of Amanda Ripley. She's a journalist. There's a site to her, one of her articles here. She's with the Solutions Journalism Network. And she came to campus to talk to us about the importance of active listening, which is really a precursor to dialogue. So she talks about intractable problems and how when we face an intractable problem where there's this conflict on an issue or an idea, that evidence and facts and charts and all those sorts of things aren't going to sway anyone. They're just going to make us sort of, more firm in our beliefs, retreat into our corners. So she talks about the most important thing when you have an intractable problem, and certainly immigration is one of them, is that you stop and listen. So you develop these skills in active listening, and part of that is looping so that people actually feel heard. So we practice that first at the beginning of the semester. We go through her whole process of active listening and actually talking with somebody and feeling heard. Which is a wonderful, and I'm happy to answer any questions about that further in the Q&A if you'd like. So then these are the 4 dialogues I do in my class. I culminate in the National Issues Forum dialogue because it's the most comprehensive dialogue on immigration policy and what the United States should do in terms of immigration policy. But I start out the class in the second week of class by asking the students, what should we call people who come here without legal status? Because we talk about the power of words, the power of language, and how the words that we use to refer to people who are undocumented, illegal, unauthorized is a very powerful thing and can stop conversation before it even starts. So rather than me telling the students what I think they should call this population of people, I let the students develop for themselves through this process of dialogue what we as a class will decide about how to, what terminology to use. And then we use that for the rest of the semester. And it's been very successful. I've done it about 5 times. And the students have come up with a consensus and we've followed it. Then we do a dialogue on border control. We do one on social integration and political integration. What does it mean to be an American? And then we use the Coming to America, which we do both in our classroom and then we take to a community partner. So we do it ourselves and then the students moderate it in a community forum somewhere in Charlotte. So the dialogue prep assignments are really important. So I know when the students come to class, they've read, Leslie talked about reading the National Issues Forum. I know they've read it because they have to do an assignment on it. And within that assignment, they actually name and frame the issue, particularly when we're not using the National Issues Forum, when I'm giving them other materials. They have to figure out, like, what is the main question? What is the main issue here? I ask them to bring in something personal. They go out and find a personal testimony or a story about people who are impacted by these issues. They talk about the values. They have to list 2 or 3 values that they bring to the discussion that are their most important values. And then they have to address this question of trade-offs, right? If I'm going to privilege this value, what trade-off is there in that? And all of this is a written assignment that they do before class, and they have to print off and bring to class. So we don't have computer screens between us. They just have the work right there with them. Some of the benefits that I've found in doing these type of dialogues is that it really increases student engagement in all the course materials. Students feel very overwhelmed by the topic of immigration. It's a very complex and divisive topic. And I find when I integrate these dialogues in, it empowers the students. It also just sort of sparks their curiosity about learning more about different parts of immigration policy, about complicating their own narratives in Amanda Ripley's terms, about what is going on, and opens them up to other perspectives and other ways of looking at things. So it's really been wonderful for me in terms of just making the class more effective. They learn more about immigration and they learn more of these civic skills. The skills that we develop in the dialogue also translate into everyday class discussion. So we're more respectful, we listen better. It's a more robust and engaged class. And then finally, the notion of empowering our students with their own civic skills. I find the students love to go out in the community and be moderators. When they do that, they really feel like they have something to add, that they have accomplished something, that they have developed this skill, and they can share it with others. And that translates more widely into their own notion of civic identity, their own civic identity, that they have a responsibility to be involved and that they have skills to be involved, so they feel empowered. So many students feel like they are just overwhelmed by political interactions. It's too divisive, it's too angry, but this helps them enter it in a way that they feel like they can contribute. So I close with, this is some of the student feedback. Of course, we all cherry pick our favorite student feedback, but it's a wonderful comment from one of my students who said, you changed the way I view the political system. It's not about being right or wrong. I mean, even if I disagree with someone, there's something valuable in what they're saying. We need to listen better, which I thought just encapsulated everything I was trying to do in the class. So very gratifying for that one.
Good, thank you all so much. I'm gonna go ahead and reduce my time just to make sure that we build an adequate time for Q&A today. So it's a pleasure to be here from Elon University, joining all of you. As times become increasingly polarized, it's becoming even more important to consider how we see our role as educators in crafting spaces to foster a free exchange of ideas, to teach students how to critically explore multiple viewpoints, and to allow students to acquire the necessary skills to engage in civil discourse. And so deliberative dialogues is one of those tools that we use on our campus. And so back in 2015, we created 2 structures to help enhance political engagement on our campus here at Elon. And the first was the Elon Political Engagement Work Group. And that is a group of students and faculty and staff that started to focus on voter registration and has evolved significantly from there. And our student team that was branded Elon Votes. And so once we launched these initiatives in 2015 and the 2016 election happened, once the election had subsided, we created a series called the Active Citizen Series to help keep the political engagement momentum going until the midterms elections 2 years later. So next slide. So as part of the Active Citizen Series, deliberative dialogues are a piece that we involve every semester. So back in 2013, we're very thankful to North Carolina Campus Compact because our staff were trained using the model that Leslie just described to all of us, using the National Issues Forum guides. And so that was our first taste, and we wondered how we could roll that out on a campus such as ours. The following year, we did something that I would not recommend to anyone for that matter. We did not launch with a National Issues Forum guide. We wrote a homegrown guide on the topic of how can we improve the intellectual climate here on campus. That was not an ideal way to start. There is such a plethora of opportunities available through NIF. We would recommend starting with one of those pre-crafted issue guides. So you may want to develop one on your own further, but not an ideal place to start. In 2015, we then began offering one campus-wide deliberative dialogue per semester, where we opened that up to our entire campus community of students and faculty and staff. That year as well, we began training faculty, staff, and students to facilitate, and we normally have 2 facilitators in each of those small groups once that happens every semester. And then we began offering opportunities for faculty to have our staff facilitate a dialogue in their individual academic courses. And where we are currently is that a couple of years back, we wanted to expand the circle of voices, and Leslie alluded to this earlier, and we began inviting members of our community to participate in those conversations because we felt like we were having echo chamber conversations oftentimes on our campus. And so that has added a new level of richness to our conversations. So next slide. Leslie's already alluded to the whole variety of National Issues Forum issue guides available. And here's how our structure works. So currently, the deliberative dialogues are housed in my office in the Coronado Center under one of our social issues clusters, and this one is under civic engagement. Every semester, we have a council on civic engagement, and they select the issue guide for the following semester. We have a student coordinator that works with our staff and part of our political engagement work group that really helps run point with one of our staff to host these dialogues every semester. And as I said, these are part of the Active Citizen series. We are on the brink next week of launching our spring semester. And so what we will do about 2 weeks prior to the start of every semester is we'll send this dialogue out and place the call. And we time it intentionally so that faculty can build this campus-wide dialogue into their courses, should they so desire. And so every year we get a number of faculty that populate our participants with students in their courses, in addition to the individual dialogues that takes place. So last slide, just keeping it brief before we open things up for Q&A. Where are we looking in terms of opportunities for growth? We certainly want to continue to expand what's happening with individual academic courses and using these dialogues within the context of academic classes, be that one of our staff facilitating or training faculty to go ahead and do those individually in their classes. And we want to continue to expand our community participants to expand the circle of voices that exist within those dialogues that we run each semester. So it's a very brief snapshot of how things happen on campus, but we'll turn things back over to Leslie.
I want to thank Bob and Maggie so much. I'm just going to quickly say why I like it. I think it gives a structured framework for these difficult conversations. It encourages perspective taking, values exploration. It challenges just the left-right approach to issues. It recognizes tensions, drawbacks, trade-offs inherent in problem solving, and it invites people into the discussion. I'll take 1 minute. Some limitations. Some have argued it's an oversimplification of huge problems, to cull it down into one issue guide, that there is limited acknowledgement of systemic oppression, that standard guides don't have the local regional context, which I said earlier you could actually integrate yourself, and then that it really is most effective when it's tied to an action agenda. There's a wonderful piece, Shut Up and Vote, which critiques this sort of way of thinking, because they're saying there are other actions that are critical also. And so sometimes by stopping and doing all this talking and deliberating, we're not getting things done. And then I shared earlier, this is only as effective as the invitation. Who's there, who's missing. And then it assumes that there's openness and flexibility in those that come to the table. There are some who argue it de-emphasizes the emotion, conflict, and opposition because it's trying to manage that and not sort of allow a lot of that. Again, it doesn't account for bias and prejudice within the actual group setting. Are people truly listening to each other? And it must be ongoing to be a true process, as you've seen that Bob and Maggie are trying to do. And then there's questions about, is this really citizen driven? Is this really grassroots? because most of the models you see are what we're talking about, where it's institutions and organizations. And this is something that the intent is to really carry this out into the community to start having these conversations so we can solve real issues on the ground. And deliberation is only one method. There's obviously other methods. There are some issues so urgent that they require a different method, but there are also space within those potentially once things maybe have settled or aren't as intense or as damaging or whatever, where you could have dialogue. And then for those who are looking at different models, I always direct them to the National Coalition for Dialogue and Deliberation, who has a streams of practice document that talks about all the different, depending on what your goals are, different models for how to get to the goals you want. This may not be the best model for you, but it's one that we found to be effective. And there's a new book, Creating Space for Democracy, that actually gives examples of different models happening on campus. There's also a Hidden Ground initiative that's launching where they are offering $150 micro grants to campuses that want to promote these sort of dialogues. You'll see there, the first part of the year, they're going to talk about healthcare, middle of the year, immigration, and towards the end, the economy. So you'll have this link. And then finally, if you want to practice this, NIF offers online forums, and I've been part of those, been trained as a facilitator, and they're very effective. We have a critical role to play. This is one method for doing that in promoting these democratic civic practices. Okay, I think we have 5 minutes, 4 minutes for questions, and I apologize for that. Tips on integrating in a co-curricular program. Bob.
Sure, and I know that the follow-up to that is we're interested in hosting a deliberation, but are worried that no one will come. We open ours up campus-wide, and we intentionally reach out to our academic colleagues and faculty on campus. So we populate that with students and faculty and staff that are interested in coming on their own, but also in opportunities that are tied to academic classes. So that helps bolster our audience. Once people are there, there's a ripple effect. But I think doing a combination of curricular and co-curricular may be an ideal way to launch, to get started, to make sure that you have a robust audience to break out into groups.
And Maggie, do you want to take the next one?
Yeah, so assessing it within the classroom, I think it's important to make it a significant portion of the grade. So for me, each of the dialogues are worth 5%. So the 4 of them together is 20% of the final grade. And in terms of assessing that, each of those 5%, it's equal part the prep assignment, how seriously they take the preparation assignment, and that they are there and actively engaged. So as long as they are there and engaged, they get that other 2.5%, they get 100% on that. So that's how I assess it. It is an issue giving up course content time. I think for faculty, we're often, we have ideas about how much we want to talk about course content wise. And so I think that can be a impediment, but I think it's well worth it in terms of other outcomes in the course.
There's a question in the chat. One, how useful is public deliberation and deliberative democracy to advance public problems of justice? Please comment on whether or not framing and moderator training should be informed by issues of unconscious bias. And then depending on your answers to these questions, what other discussion models might you be familiar with that might be useful to promote not only civic engagement, but socially responsible expressions of civic engagement? I think some of that might have been answered.
Yeah, so again, when I talked about that critique about the bias and other pieces, I would say that the most ideal way to address that would be through some of the other models to make this potentially an ongoing effort where you're building in different sorts of dialogue. So what comes to mind is sustained dialogue, which is a model that definitely does a lot of that equity work, the bias work. Everyday Democracies model absolutely uses that sort of framework, to look at systemic issues that are impacting the issues that we're trying to solve and what we're talking about. And so I would say that this model itself is really about this practice of understanding how problems have multiple solutions, how they're complicated, how people bring different values, how there's always trade-offs, and but it has to be in the context or contextualized in the reality that we are in a world that does have all these biases and all these systems that are oppressive and that sort of thing. But that is not how this is designed. But I think that you could certainly add those discussions in, which is why I would say Maggie is probably in a really good place, because she's in the classroom able to go deeper and unpack a lot of that. Do you all have anything to add around whether or not this model has the capacity to do that, or other models that you would recommend?
I would just say that the active listening, the looping model of active listening, of deep listening, is a really important precursor. So when people feel heard and you actually spend time on working on that first, then you can mitigate some of the other issues that are involved in that. Not all of them, obviously, but some of them.
And I think whatever model you use, ultimately we're trying to get at how do we start to enhance conversations where people are staying at the table and continuing conversations about a variety of topics and not canceling each other out. How ultimately we've gone from we can agree to disagree to I am right and you are wrong, to not only are you wrong, but you're morally corrupt as a human being, and I will not acknowledge you as a human being. So ultimately, I think from the 10,000-foot view, there is no ideal model, but how do we start to create conversation and dialogue to eliminate the tribalism that is increasing in this country and allow people to look at ideas and issues from multiple viewpoints that may be those beyond their own. And I think we start to expand those circles with the variety of models that we've talked about today, this being only one of them, as imperfect as it may be.
Great. So we're at time, but there was one question. Are these dialogues held on a proactive recurring effort or a reactive effort due to issues happening on your campuses? So if we could quickly answer that before we close out.
So I will say we are in the process of developing and piloting an issue guide around what do we do about Confederate monuments. And I would say that is absolutely reactive because we were caught by surprise a couple of years ago that this would be a key issue that our campuses and our communities in North Carolina are facing. So the ones we're trying, I think that you can create issue guides that are reactive. I would also say, and Bob, I'll answer for you, I know that in the case of Elon, when they chose to do the immigration guide, it was clearly because that was a big issue in, the consciousness of the country. So you can use it as reactive, like we need to talk about this, or you could, talk about something like hunger that is always an issue, but that is still continues to impact our students. So
great. Well, thank you all so much. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to the attendees. I also put in the chat a link. We have a $250 discount to our national conference from our partnership with Net Impact if you do a deliberative dialogue on your campus. So check out that link if you're interested. And thank you all again. Until next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you.